has represented India at multiple international forums for over a career spanning 3.5 decades. During this time, he would invariably be told that Indian negotiators were among the best in the business. And yet, several of his interlocutors would ask in the same breath why India was such a tough customer when it came to multilateral negotiations. It was hard to escape the view, held even by India's friends, that the country was somehow more of a naysayer than a partner in key international parleys. India is not very different from other countries in seeking to protect where necessary and advance where possible. Its national interest. India is slowly but surely from being an alleged naysayer to becoming a putative partner for the world in key multilateral negotiation. This reflects its growing political, economic, and strategic clout in the world today that has led to India's moment in world diplomacy. When this transformation is fuller and more substantial, India will be able to fulfill its manifest destiny of becoming a leading power capable of shaping global rules. For today's book discussion, we have an eminent panel of faculty members. Firstly, our author, Ambassador Dr. Mohan Kumar, has an outstanding career in the Indian Foreign Service, lasting about 36 years, which culminated in him being India's ambassador to France, based in Paris. Under his watch, the Indo-French strategic partnership was strengthened and consolidated further in spheres such as defense, space, nuclear and solar energy, smart cities, and investment. Ambassador Dr. Mohan Kumar has enormous experience in the area of international trade. He was India's lead negotiator, first at the GATT and then at the WTO, in crucial areas such as intellectual property rights, services, dispute settlement, rules, and technical barriers to trade. He was a leading member of India's delegation at the WTO ministerial conferences held in Marrakesh, Seattle, and Doha. Next, we have Professor Sudarshan Ramaswamy, who has held distinguished careers in the domains of research, development programming, and governance. After he obtained a master's degree in economics from the Delhi School of Economics, he was selected as a Rhodes Scholar. His extensive career includes pivotal roles at the Ford Foundation, UNDP, and various academic institutions, culminating in his current position as the founding dean of the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy at OP Jindal Global University. Sudarshan sir's prolific publications underscore his interdisciplinary prowess and vast experience in development programs, human rights, governance, and public policy. Next, we have Professor Dr. Shriparna Pathak, who is an associate professor and associate dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs. She specializes in the study of Chinese foreign policy. With a doctorate from Jawaharlal Nehru University, her expertise spans academia, research, and consultancy roles. Fluent in English, Mandarin, Hindi, Bengali, and Assamese, she has been a recipient of the Joint Fellowship awarded by the Ministry of Human Resources and Development, India and China Scholarship Council, Government of the People's Republic of China, and she spent 2 years in China actively researching various aspects of the Chinese domestic economy. She actively engages in Track 2 dialogues shaping India-China relations. Then, we have Ambassador Dr. Jitendranath Mishra, who's a retired diplomat. He holds a PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University. He served as ambassador in Portugal and Laos, and the Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. He's a professor of diplomatic practice at the Jindal School of International Affairs of OP Jindal Global University, a senior fellow at the Jindal India Institute, and is distinguished fellow at the Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security Studies. He's also the author of the book Radha Land and Worlds Beyond. I would now like to please invite panelist and moderator Dr. Shriparna Pathak to take over the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, and you already set the motion in place. But just to add a bit to it, and then after that I will request Ambassador Mohan Kumar to speak a little bit more about the book. The point is that this book comes at a very correct time, if I could say that. Why is it the correct time? Because while India's moment has always been there, it was not really grasped. What Mohan Kumar sir does is that he's covered this wide range of history, starting from even before India was independent and how India did undertake several leadership roles. Now what has happened is that after the two world wars ended, and despite all the efforts so far to ensure that devastation of the scale of those two world wars never happens, currently the world sees a lot of conflicts. One of them is discussed in the book, the Russia-Ukraine war. The other sorts of conflicts which have completely sort of put a lot of pressure on the existing rules-based international order, are China's aggression against India, Taiwan, Philippines, and so on, or even the unfortunate events folding in West Asia between Israel and Palestine, and so on. Now, India takes a very different approach from what China takes, or from the sort of approach which the West takes. So in that, India finds a lot of traction as a leader of the international system. So Ambassador Mohan Kumar's book, India's Moment, comes at the right time. And I'm not going to speak more about it now. I'm going to speak about it at a later stage. But over to you, Ambassador Mohan Kumar.
Thank you, Sriparna. Thank you very much. I think it's fantastic for an author that you have an interested audience and a fantastic panel, beginning with Professor Sudarshan. So I'm really, really grateful to each and every one of you for making it. The golden rule for authors at book discussions is not to speak much, because you are here to listen, frankly. I've done what I've done, so, it's all there in black and white. So it really should be listening to people and what they have to say. Just 2-3 things. Authors don't write books for making money. So you do this for, you get drained at the end of it all, but you do it to get appreciation from your peers, to get constructive criticism from your peers, but also if students are interested and they can read the book, there's nothing which pleases you more, frankly. So I'll just confine myself to the main takeaways of this book. I think why the book has been written, you have illustrated very well. Frankly, it's a question that was bothering me, not just from the Western interlocutors, I have to say. Even the interlocutors from the global South used to tell India, you guys are cussed, frankly. You may be brilliant negotiators, but you are saying no all the time. You're not helping the cause of multilateralism. So I think I felt the strong need to write the book, if only to explain to my own self and to others as to why India does what it does. In fact, I think I'm doing a book discussion in Chennai where I think we came up with a more appropriate title, if you like. I could have even had it as the title of my book, Decoding India's Negotiating Mantra. That is the title, or at least the discussion that's going to happen at the Chennai International Center on 4th. I thought that was an appropriate title as well for my book. So the main takeaways, I think the original contribution by me, for good or worse, is that I have come up with this integrated assessment framework comprising 6 criteria. I call it a matrix, actually. And the 6 criteria, one of them, I call them the poverty veto, the Gandhi litmus test or the poverty veto. I sincerely believe the 500 million people or more who are actually poor in India, they cast a shadow on the negotiating position of India, inevitably. And in India, whether you're objecting to intellectual property rights, patenting of medicines, whether you're objecting to the complete phase-out of coal in climate change negotiations, it is all, or whether you're buying Russian oil, for that matter, at a discounted price, it's all for the 500 million. And they cast a veto, and I call it the poverty veto. Policy space should be known to those who follow international trade. India needs more policy space than any other comparable country I can think of. So if China needs 5 years, if the United States needs 3 years, India will need 10 years. We have a complicated federal setup. If you have to change your laws and to bring yourselves into conformity with international agreements and commitments that you have taken, you will need more space than others. Also because I genuinely think we are the only country now, because China used to be like India no longer, I think we're the only country which now displays characteristics of being an emerging country, developing country, and least developed country, all rolled into one. You can see evidence of all 3 countries in India. Some of it very small, and a lot of it very big. But let's not forget, the parts of India are least developed. I have lived in a least developed country called Democratic Republic of Congo for 3 years, and I actually found Democratic Republic of Congo better in some respects. And now this would be heretic if I was not speaking in a university. If you say it outside, everybody will jump on you and say that we are well on our way to Viksit Bharat and so on. So anyway, go through that integrated assessment framework. It's got other things which are more obvious, like geopolitical imperatives, domestic politics, realpolitik, material gain, and even commitment to principles, right? So all of it is there, but I would say the poverty veto and the policy space are the ones which dominate. And on the three case studies I have picked up, WTO was an obvious choice given my background. And I also believe WTO, in my 37 years in the Foreign Service, this was the toughest negotiation for me, WTO, especially being India's intellectual property rights negotiator in Doha. That was my toughest moment. It was impossible because America was coming from a completely opposite direction. Europe had its own priorities. India was the only country which was objecting. And everybody would come and say, what's wrong with you? You know, every other country is willing to accept patents on medicines. Why the hell is India not accepting the same? So you had to explain to them, we've got these 500 million people who are willing to queue up for Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, not 500, 800 million actually. So you could argue 500 million is conservative. There are even more people who are poor than 500. So that demanded an explanation. But I think the choice of Ukraine was that of the publisher, not mine. I have to clarify. WTO was an obvious choice. Climate change was obvious because I was India's ambassador in Paris when COP21 concluded. I was intimately associated with that deal, which happened in the Paris Climate Change Accords. So the only thing which is not my doing is Ukraine. I had figured out something esoteric, nuclear disarmament, and the publisher very frankly told me the book will not sell if you do things like nuclear disarmament. And they said, can you do Ukraine? I said, I will try because I had to be sure that the integrated assessment framework that I had designed would work for Ukraine. To my great surprise and utter satisfaction, it worked. So I said, Ukraine is fine. It makes it more topical. People will read it and so on. So Ukraine demanded, I think, 50-60% of my effort. WTO, I could have done it anytime. Climate change was also not too difficult. A lot of people have done seminal work. Sunita Narayan. There are so many who have done such good work on climate change. I could rely on secondary sources. Ukraine proved to be difficult because I had to get hold of the discussions in the American Senate when India was bitterly criticized. And I have quoted some of that in my book where in the beginning the Americans felt there was a real danger to the relationship in the beginning because we were genuinely, it was thought that India was on the wrong side of history, not condemning Russia and not doing enough to condemn what was going on. So we had to overcome that. And I genuinely thought it was a crowning moment for India's diplomacy. I don't know if it is obvious to all of you, but it was very difficult for India to do this balancing act in terms of, trying to balance what we do vis-a-vis Russia, which is a very serious partner, and our relationship with the United States, which was important. In WTO, I make and I'm going to stop in just 2 minutes. In the chapter on WTO, I make the point, which is counterfactual. We are considered a naysayer, especially in the WTO, but we did make some positive recommendations which did not find traction among the powerful members of WTO. For example, there is a provision in the intellectual property rights agreement that there should be a higher level of geographical indications for wines and spirits, right? So champagne, you cannot make champagne in Jhumri Talaya and Sonipat and sell it as champagne. That would be objectionable. But you can make basmati rice in Texas and sell it as Texmati. That's fine. That is absolutely fine. So I took issue with that. I said, why are you attaching so much importance to champagne when everything about basmati rice is very comparable to champagne? The quality of the soil, the Dehradun basmati, everybody who appreciates basmati knows if basmati rice comes from Trichy, you're going to hate it. It's very sticky. Whereas the basmati rice that comes from Dehradun, the long grain, everybody knows that. So I said, why do you make this difference? The only answer they could come up with is, no, this was a deal between United States and European Union. Agriculture was so difficult in the WTO. So they said, you can put forward a proposal. So we put forward a proposal for Alfonso mangoes, Kolhapuri chappal, then not to mention basmati rice, everything we did, very detailed proposals. The Greeks joined us by saying Greek yogurt is something that deserves geographical indication. I said, fantastic. The WTO just threw the proposal out of the door. They said no. So to me, therefore, to blame India for being a naysayer is not fair. Secondly, we made a very serious proposal on movement of natural persons. You know, there is this old joke about India going to God last after every other country has got what it wanted in terms of, you know, Switzerland getting the best landscape or the tourism, etc., etc. India went last and God said, I've run out of things to give you, but I'll give you lots of people. You can have that. So we have people. So we said, okay, let's form a framework for movement of natural persons. And the WTO said, no, immigration is sensitive. We can't do this. So I said, everything that I'm asking, you are saying can't be done. And everything you are telling me in terms of high intellectual property rights, I'm supposed to accept. So anyway, that's what I make in my chapter on WTO. On climate change, I actually make a very fundamental point, which I believe nobody else has made. We are the only major country today which is being asked to follow a low-carbon pathway to development. China burns more coal than the rest of the world put together. So China has not even tried to be environmentally friendly. They've just played everybody in the world beautifully. And they've hid behind us. And so they've done what they've done. I think they are 10 times worse than US and others in terms of polluters. So the only country which is being told, no, you cannot do the same mistakes that we've done, is India. We are the only country which is being told, because we are at such a low level of development, that they are saying, if you continue to do the things we have done, then you will bring planet down. So we are the only ones who are being, so that's, and I also make a somewhat outlandish point that we must take a case to the International Criminal Court. That's the point I make. Seriously, Sunita Narayan is the one who gave me this idea. I think we should go to the International Criminal Court, which has an environment bench now. And we should tell them that the rest of the countries have not given us a global carbon budget for 1.4 billion people. So if you don't give us that, we cannot be environmentally friendly. And so screw the rest of you. We will do what we can and burn as much coal as we want. Forgive my language. So that's the one I make in climate change. On Ukraine, I actually compliment the External Affairs Minister, which might seem to some of you like fulsome praise going to a former colleague, but I genuinely like the person and what he is doing for India. He had prescribed in one of his books that the mantra for India's foreign policy should be engage the engage the United States, cultivate European Union, manage China, and bring Japan into play. This is what he had said, something to that effect. You can Google it. I think we have put it into practice when it comes to Ukraine. It was not easy managing our relationship with the United States and continuing to have good relations with Russia. Not easy at all. But I think we've done more than a decent job. Last but not least, the title is also not my title, and I think the book sold well because of the title. I kind of feel sheepish about this because India's moment gives the impression that I'm generally saying India has arrived, we've done a fantastic. That is not what a book is about. I am merely saying that we have the potential to become a leading power. All the conditions are there. It is India's moment of sorts, but it is neither indefinite in time or space. That's what I'm saying. I'm basically saying, international relations doesn't stand still. You may have a period of 5 years when this golden period lasts. Everybody is in love with India. Everybody hates China, but Vietnam seems to be grabbing all the spoils anyway. But who knows? India may have this golden window for some time. And I make the last point, which is that without bringing this 500 million people to 100 million people, because I don't think we can bring it down to zero, but 150 million people, and without our GDP going to 10 trillion, I think we can stop dreaming about calling ourselves any power. Forget about global, regional. This 2.73 trillion for a population of 1.4 billion, we can have this debate on population, which I love to have with my colleague Dean Sudarshan. But be that as it may, if you don't reach 10 trillion, and if you don't bring this poor people down to 10, 15%, because right now it is 30, 35%, I think it's ridiculous to say that. You look at the power differential between China and India, that will tell you. You just don't have the means to tackle China, which is why you are running after US quadrilateral, you're running after Europe and saying, get me into the critical mineral security partnership. We are saying to Australia, Japan, Indonesia, Philippines. All this is external balancing, right? An IR scholar will tell you it's external balancing. And all this is because you just don't have the means to cope with this enormous power differential between India, China. So I'll stop here. It was a book meant to provoke. It was a book meant to help you both understand and evaluate India's negotiating posture. That is what it was meant to be. But Sriparna, I'll hand it over to you. I'd really love to hear from the three of you before we give it to the students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. But before we go into the panel discussion, I would like to acknowledge and thank Mr. Sedula Mamabolo, who is a counselor at the South African High Commission in New Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. We'll now move on into the panel discussion, and Professor Sudarshan, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very delighted to be here. I find that I'm in the company of a great scholar and a poet whose book I read, Radha Land. And what I discovered reading this book is that Professor Mohan Kumar is a philosopher. The reason I say that is because it's one of those things that philosophy does, which is to produce a certain coherence in phenomena that otherwise are very disparate and seemingly disconnected. David Hume, in his philosophy of mind, talks about how everything around us, we get it through our senses, sense perceptions. They are like sticks, each one of these perceptions. But what is the bundle? What is it that holds these different perceptions together in one bundle, right? So that's a philosophical exercise, which Mohan has done, in that we've had all this rich experience in foreign policy, even from before independence, in the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles. India had a seat. He makes a reference to that, but they're all over a period of time. They're different subjects, different things, different actors, and yet how to make sense of all this, right? What is it that coherently holds these different experiences together, right? Which is fundamentally a philosophical task. So, there is a quip among economists that it works all right in practice, but will it work in theory, right? Or the other quip is that, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. But in practice, there's a world of difference between theory and practice. So, but therefore, this task which Mohan has accomplished is quite phenomenal. It's not pigeonholing it in the usual, I don't know very much about international relations, but you're not putting it in the realist pigeonhole or the liberal pigeonhole or something that you might call constructivism, all these words and concepts that academics like to engage in. And the problem with many of that is that none of them has had any practical experience of actual diplomacy and doing anything. It's kind of armchair theorizing. And what this book is not is, it is not armchair theorizing. It produces a framework that makes a lot of sense, that coheres different things that are being done at different times. And it's eminently readable. I had forgotten, I think in my undergraduate days, I was among those who demonstrated against Mr. Alfred Dunkel, but I'd forgotten that we had the term DDT for it, the poison of Mr. Dunkel. The Dunkel draft text was DDT. And so he has a reference to that. So of course that made me smile. And there are many points when reading the book that you will smile. And it's a kind of a unique humor that Professor Mohan Kumar has. It's not the English kind, which is self-deprecating, but this is a kind of humor, genuinely, which is not offensive to anyone. That is important. What I've learned from reading this book is something that, as a public policy person, I ought to worry about. And that is, while explaining India's stance in the different fora and the 3 case studies that he has taken, using these, yardsticks of, did this stand, is it consistent with India's commitment and concern to removing poverty and to care about its people, particularly when, unlike Scandinavia, which at one point Norway was very poor, they had a safety net of a comprehensive kind for people. But we still do not have it in this country. So therefore, each of these decisions internationally might have outcomes that hurt the lowest rung of people. And is that, was there some consciousness about that? Did it influence what we said? And he shows that it does in these contexts. It's interesting also that he refers to it as the Gandhi litmus test. Now, Gandhi is drawn into many things. When there's an Indian neuroscientist who talks about the Gandhi neurons, that he's making a reference to neurons that trigger empathy. In other words, if one person yawns inadvertently, another person will yawn. If somebody is very sad, inadvertently, another person will also feel sad. And so there's a theory that the neurons have a mode of communicating across persons. It's not just in one brain. And he called it the Gandhi neuron. And here it's a reference, of course, to what Gandhiji said to a young man who said he was in doubt and he didn't know what he should be doing with his life. And so he said that, you think of whatever action you're going to do, will it make a difference to the most wretched and deprived person that you've come across? And if it's going to make some difference, positive difference to that person, then you should be confident that you're on the right track. So that, as a mantra, to use your term, informs our negotiations. That's very well established. But as a public policy scholar, I'm concerned about some references in the book to the internal coherence of the government of India. You see, while identifying these, the theoretical framework which explains what India has been doing, what it doesn't, what he alludes to but hasn't emphasized is that, okay, there can be dissonances. One dissonance is domestic politics. And that is a bit, as Mohan points out, a little puzzling because unlike many constitutions around the world, the Constitution of India gives full powers to the executive to conclude binding treaty obligations that are in international law binding. Most constitutions don't have it. The United States is famous because everything has to be, not just, the problem for the United States is that it should also be mindful of the different states of the United States. each of which has a constitution. So not many people know that the US is not a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of Children because of this, because the definition of who is a child is different in different states of the United States, and the federal government or the president acting as the federal executive cannot, gainsay what might be the stance of Georgia or Texas. Now, so on the face of it, two countries haven't ratified the treaty. Somalia, because it hasn't got any government, and the United States, which does have a very sophisticated government, far too sophisticated maybe to ratify this. So we have the advantage that our executive can make these, but still it's there that the opposition looms large in the minds of the political leaders who are responsible at any given point in time for taking a policy stance, whether it be respect to the Duncan draft and so on. So that's a dissonance, but that is to be expected in a way. It's not undesirable that domestic political considerations are taken into account, that the Mohan somehow thinks that, the opposition shouldn't consider itself as duty-bound to oppose everything, regardless of what the issue might be. But it's healthy for the executive that happens to have power to be conscious and mindful of an opposition. It will be a very sad day for any democracy, particularly a parliamentary form of democracy, if the political masters think it doesn't matter what the opposition might say or do or think. So it's important, therefore, that Mohan uses that as well in explaining what happens in the course of negotiations. But there's one area where I don't know how it happened, that firstly, with respect to climate change, it's such a phenomenon that has such wide ramifications. I mean, it's everything, right? Climate change, affects practically everything. But many governments think it has to do with the environment. And many governments make the mistake of saying that the ministry that ought to deal with this subject is environment. And we made that mistake. And I think that was very, very sad and unfortunate, because, diplomacy is it's probably, I don't know whether it should be, deserves to be called a noble profession alongside medicine, but law is regarded as a noble profession. And if you are in Punjab, you correctly pronounce lawyers as liars. We did this. So we thought, climate change, it must be an environment subject. So let's ask the Minister of the Environment to deal with it. And by all accounts, that was an unhappy and unfortunate experience. There's Jairam Ramesh as a minister, followed by somebody who, I don't know what, with due respect, what she could have said or did, Jayanti Natarajan. And then lack of clarity as to who is taking the lead. You have a fantastic and experienced, highly respected diplomat in Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, and then you have, India speaking in two voices, which he alludes to, but it's a kind of a teaser. You want to know more about it, and particularly from the point of view of policy making and coherence. And it's not just foreign policy here; it's about national policy as well. And in a federal polity, how do you get a coherence and a consistency between state stances and the government of India? And one of the things that I personally believe we've lost in the abolition of the Planning Commission is a forum where the states and people thinking about the development of the states would engage in a dialogue with the union government and with the ministries on a regular basis according to a calendar. That no longer happens. And since the Niti Aayog has no money, no matter how brilliant its ideas may be, there are no takers for it. If you give money, I will listen to you, right? That's a kind of a universal law. So these thoughts occurred to me reading this book. So I again want to compliment Professor Mohan Kumar for having done the task of a philosopher, which is to produce, I mean, in the case of Hume, what holds the bundle of experiences together is a memory and consciousness of each individual. And you would think that it's really very difficult to get a coherent framework in which you can see why is India doing what it is doing, allowing for some aberrations, as when there are some aberrations. India-backed Prime Minister's office backed Shashi Tharoor for UN Secretary General. Now, if they had listened to the Foreign Ministry, they'd have said it's a convention in the UN that no permanent member of the Security Council can have be the Secretary General, right? So what signals are you sending? Are you no longer interested in that objective of having a permanent seat in the Security Council if you're going to back somebody for Secretary General? See, this dissonance happens, and I think your next book ought to be about these dissonances within different ministries, personalities, and so on, which play a part. But on the whole, I think the record is terrific. And I would say, though, the title, as you acknowledged, is a bit misleading, because then it looks like it's not, this book is not about the Modi doctrine, I must say. And therefore, it's a scholarly piece of work, and thank you very much for having written it.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was wonderful, in the ways as to how you tied up domestic politics and international politics. And I think I agree. Ambassador Mohan Kumar has been a philosopher in writing this book. So thank you so much. We'll move on into, the thoughts of the next panelist. Ambassador Jitendranath Mishra, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's 3:38, so I'll time this very carefully. From philosopher, perhaps to practitioner? Well, philosophers can also be practitioners, and practitioners can be philosophers. And everybody is a politician in his own way. I have read this book carefully, so I'm going to talk about what I've read and what I think about it. And some of it will be repetition, but then I've put in the hard work, and I'd like you to know that I put in the hard work. So, the Maharaja of Bikaner participates in the Paris Peace Conference. This is my new learning. Thank you. 1919, after the Treaty of Versailles, making India the only non-self-governing founding member of the League of Nations. Very important. India was internationalist long before it became independent formally. India has always been internationalist. This is Western propaganda that India was a closed society, Indians are insular, they think they are the best, and so on and so forth. Reject these tropes, dear students. So Girija Shankar Bajpayee, India's Agent General, signed the Declaration of the United Nations in January 1, 1942, and India signs the UN Charter in June 1945, making it a founding member of the UN. Yet, alas, China steals it from us, because technically they are the victor of the Second World War, though we lost many more soldiers, not just in the Second, but in the First World War. I want you to please think about this, retrospect. More than 1 million died in the First World War, Indian soldiers, not properly acknowledged by the Western world even today. And that's why I love Dr. Jaishankar, because he tells it from the Indian point of view as it is. Domestic factors shaping India's stand in multilateral negotiations, fantastic. The way you have linked this, and you are actually talking real politics throughout the book. You're not talking philosophy. Though you have a philosophy of writing the book, the 6 points that you have talked about in the framework called the Integrated Assessment Framework, and you are discussing everything in terms of that framework and the 6 points that are contained in it. That's fantastic. But that's about framework. That's not philosophy. You are talking about your real world experience. As Dean Sudarshan said, the world is as it is, as Naipaul said famously in his novel, A Bend in the River. The world is as it is, and these little men who think it's not are little men. It's a very cruel world, dear friends. Then, what I like about the book, therefore, is that it's honest, it's truthful, in tone it's modest. You're never talking about yourself, and you are one of those uncommon breed of diplomats who does that, or who doesn't do that. Never have you talked about yourself in this book. I did this and I did that. Direct knowledge, WTO, of course, formidable. Reflection, even introspection. Non-partisan, you're talking about unlikely coalitions regarding the RCEP and the nuclear deal and everything else. The left, the extreme left and the extreme right, so-called extreme right now, BJP, and the CPM are on the same side. So that's domestic politics. But Dean Sudarshan also talked about domestic politics and governance and the cohesion of the government. That's a very important point. I think you're talking about governance, perhaps. Then non-partisan, very civil, very polite, evidence-based. You have given a lot of data to back up your arguments, particularly GDP and GNP data, economic indicators. And you communicate complex ideas in very simple language. For example, you're talking about commitments during the multilateral trade negotiations in GATT and WTO were 3 words I picked up: irrevocable, quantifiable, binding. All of you can understand that. Anybody can understand that. This is not jargon. This is not academic jargon or diplomatic jargon. It's very clear language. I love that. The integrated assessment framework, the Gandhi litmus test. Wow, great phrase. I loved it, absolutely. Policy space, domestic politics, we talked about that. Geopolitical imperatives, and that's the realist in you. You are talking this entire book in terms of realist theory, frankly. And India was never a naysayer. But India said something. Saying no is also saying something. That's what I'm saying. Or saying nothing is also saying something. Or doing nothing is also doing something. As our late Prime Minister Narasimha Rao said, doing nothing is actually doing something. But because it is a deliberate choice that you're making. So real politics, you're talking about material gain, commitment to multilateralism, etc. The 6 principles: domestic politics, geopolitical imperatives, and you have even, I believe that you said that Ukraine was a kind of, you were cajoled into doing Ukraine in this book by the publisher to sell the book. That's why I was baffled. Why Ukraine, you know? I was also baffled by the title, but you answered that question. But I'll come to that later. Because the book is not about the title, and the title is not about the book. I learned a lot about GATT. I'm not a multilateralist at all in my career. I've been a bilateralist, a political officer all through. Dominated by the powerful, but not asking for reciprocal commitments by the developing countries. That's GATT. UNCTAD, the voice of the developing countries, WTO, GSP, and all that. Great. And you say that even if it is dominated by the powerful, GATT was sympathetic to the developing countries with waivers on the rules of GATT, and what you call an enabling clause. That these are the rules, but to help the developing world, to enable their concerns, meeting their concerns, we'll do that. Very simple language, anyone can understand that. But voluntary. So there is some tension. How can it be enabling and voluntary at the same time? So it's a gray zone. But that's what diplomacy is. Diplomacy is always in the gray zone. It's never black or white. You call this a masterstroke under which developing countries had no obligation to make non-reciprocal concessions. And this is where you have argued that India was always, even when India was poor, it was punching above its weight because its diplomacy was clear. I think that's where there was good governance between MEA and Commerce and others. I don't know whether that still exists. Ministry of External Affairs and Ministry of Commerce. I think our our multilateral trade negotiations have been outstanding, acknowledged to be among the best in the world all through. And we were never naysayers. It's very important to understand that because this is Western propaganda, that India was a naysayer and India is the fall guy and India spoils the party and all that. And you answered that beautifully about basmati and champagne. You brought up that example. And you faced the frustration in negotiations and you fought for India. That's great. China, I've argued this publicly many times. How can China say it's the voice of the global South? China is an $18 trillion economy with $12,000 of per capita GDP. India is $2,600 per capita GDP with now a $4 trillion economy according to IMF figures of late 2023. We've just touched 4 trillion. Good. So that's the thing. I'd love to quote this. I have about 5 or 6 minutes? Yes, sir. Yeah, please tell me when I have 3 minutes.
6 minutes.
I'll rush through. Okay. In India's naysaying or otherwise, when dealing with the world in international negotiations, has much more to do with the Gandhian litmus test than with any preconceived negotiating strategy. It is not reflexive nationalism. It's not a reflection. India is not a porcupine. India is a fighter. That's what I'm trying to say. A porcupine, if you touch it, you know, it reacts. In Odia, it's called Lajakuli Lota. You know, there's a plant, and if you touch that, all the leaves just fold in. India is not like that. India had to protect itself. It was a very poor country with very few cards. Today's India is different. So I love that when you say India shifts from being a naysayer in 2005 to being actively engaging, and even on some issues lately on climate, for example, on green fuels, biofuels, green energy, leading. So it becomes a constructive negotiator because, again, you're talking real politics. Your poverty rates are falling. So you have more hard power at your disposal. You have more tools to work with. Diplomacy without the boots on the ground is nothing. All your skills are worth nothing. Even with low level of skills, you can achieve a lot if you are powerful. Diplomacy is sugarcoating, a lot of it. And sometimes it can be pure skill also if you're lucky. So further, being a naysayer or a stakeholder in international negotiations is not a preconceived matter of policy choice. It is governed by the domestic, economic, and social situation. The poverty veto, as you call it. Wonderful phrase. Poverty veto, Gandhi litmus test. I agree the 2008 civil nuclear agreement with the US was a lot about strategic choices. The US wants to help India bolster its capabilities because the US is aware of a fast-rising China competing against US hegemony. Period. That was the US motivation. Then domestic consensus over foreign policy. Despite ideological differences, I talked about that, the BJP and the CPIM both rejected the Dunkel draft on the TRIPS, agriculture, textiles, and clothing. Wow. The BJP is right-wing, and the CPIM is extreme left-wing. So who says that we can't work together? We can, when national interests are concerned. And that's why I talk about a second consensus in India, as the Dean said. We need a second consensus today in these fraught times, I'm sorry to say. So the BJP and Congress work together in rejecting RCEP. Look at the Southeast Asians, they don't take us seriously. Same thing, because our interests are not aligned with theirs, period. It's all about China. We don't want Chinese goods being dumped in India. The IMF World Economic Outlook, I just want to give the figures. Per capita GDP in India is projected at $2,731 in April 2024. India is in the 141st position out of 195 economies in terms of nominal GDP. In 1993, India's GDP per capita was 6.48% of global GDP per capita. Very interesting. 2 minutes left. So what I'm trying to say is that India's nominal per capita GDP is 48 times lower than the richest country and approximately 10.87 times greater than the world's poorest country. We are 37th in Asia. So therefore, can we say that it is India's moment? Definitely not. And I think you answered that question. I gave these figures just to illustrate that we are behind Bangladesh. Vietnam's per capita GDP is $4,200. Ours is $2,600. We were equal 10 years ago. That's the state of the Indian economy. Per capita GDP should be the benchmark. I can go on and on. Need for a code of conduct, definitely. As far as domestic politics is concerned, you referred to that and you talked about that. I talk about the second political consensus in India. The consensus of the 50s is gone. We really need a second consensus if we want to ascend to become the world's premier power, which is the forecast of Politico magazine. I hope and I'm sure it will be true in the year 2100. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Mishra. I think one of the points which I really loved about your presentation was that, how we need to ensure that parties work together. And you gave some really good examples as to how, BJP and CPIM have worked and as to how we need the second consensus. So thank you so much. I'll now start my few quick observations, and I need to time myself as well, 3:53. I'll try and keep it short because it's very difficult to speak after such eloquent speakers and to be the last speaker. So I'll try and keep it short. I'll start by disagreeing with the other panelists and Ambassador Mohan Kumar regarding the title of the book. Maybe my line of thinking is more in line with, HarperCollins. I think the book is correctly named India's Moment. As you said, it's not indefinite in time and space, but the golden window is there, as it has always been there. You've talked about it since the time of, Treaty of Versailles and so on. India's moment has always been there. It is there till now, which is why I think the book is called India's Moment. To elucidate as to how it has always been there, but we've not somehow, for whatever reasons, not been able to grasp it. In the last chapter of the book, you also talk about, how this golden window can disappear if we don't take cognizance of the fact that the moment is there and as to how we need to get on with our internal balancing. Otherwise, the moment will disappear. So I think the publishers were right in mentioning it, in calling it India's Moment. Maybe it was for saleability. Maybe it was, because the book is honestly about India's moment. That's what I felt when I was reading the book. The book also starts, the first two lines itself, they start with India's interests and engagement with the world, and then you go on into the pre-independence days. So interests and engagements are important factors which help in creation of that moment, which is why it should be called India's Moment. Now, why does India have to navigate changing power equations around the world? Why does it have to do it in a certain way, which of course the West or China do not understand? The answer is not because India wants to be the leader of the international system. Of course, every country wants to be the leader of the international system. The answer is given by Ambassador Mohan Kumar when he talks about the Constitution of India. And he mentions Article 51, and he states that, in Article 51, it is clearly mentioned that the state will endeavor to promote international peace and security. It will foster respect for international law and treaty obligations. This is what is mentioned in our Constitution. So we have to do it in a certain way. There is no other way that we can do it. But the question still remains as to how does India deal with the world? Now, how does India deal with the world? Read the book. But just to mention as to why it is important, and I think I had mentioned this when I was making my opening remarks earlier, the book comes at a right time. Why do I say it comes at a right time? Not because, India is one of the very few spots in the very gloomy global economy, not because yoga and Bollywood are great, and because we have great soft power credentials, not because, the IMF has said that, we are now a $4 trillion economy and so on. The reason is because there's a lot of confusion in other parts of the world as to how to understand what India does. First, there has been a lethargy in trying to understand how and why India does certain things. And, Ambassador Mohan Kumar mentioned the whole thing about basmati and wines and spirits. The way I see it when I read about it or when you speak about it is that there is a lethargy to understand that, let's not move beyond this very colonial mindset that basmati can be texmati no matter where it is grown, but sonepat cannot have wines. You mentioned when you spoke to interlocutors. Now, I speak to track 2 level practitioners a lot. And this is something which had happened last year. I was speaking in Taiwan to a delegate or a partner from the UK. And then generally jokes began as to how India has had its revenge because Rishi Sunak now. So I mentioned that we have enough politicians. He's not us. He's out and out British. Please keep him. So then it went on into, yes, yeah, you're right. Yeah, his culture is very British. Then it went on into the FTA and as to why India and UK cannot have the FTA. And in my counterparts' understanding, it's because we have cultural differences. Very easy to dump cultural differences on India. So I said, what do you mean by cultural differences though? Is it not enough that we are speaking in English? Is it not enough that our constitution is modeled mostly on your constitution? What is cultural differences? So he said, I've read, your EAM's book on the India Way, and I constantly read his book. But still, there is so much to understand as to why India does these weird things. So I said, okay, fair enough, weird things. Let me try and explain in my way. So I said, do you watch Netflix? He said, yes. I said, yes, of course. Who doesn't watch Netflix? So I said, so talking about cultural differences, this is how I see cultural differences. This is how most of us see. I said, have you watched Norway versus Mrs. Chatterjee? So he said, no. What Mrs. what? So I wrote it down. I said, please do watch it. Now, her children were snatched away from her because you saw, and there were you dumped it on cultural differences in the end because India won the case. Mrs. Chatterjee, after a lot of harassment, she won the case and got her children back. But at least 4 to 5 years later, and one of the elder child had a lot of mental health issues. The 3 most pertinent charges which were slapped on Mrs. Chatterjee were that first, she force feeds. What is force feeding? She feeds with her hands. So she force feeds her children. Children are not safe with her. Second is, she might crush her children to death because she co-sleeps with them. Fair enough. Third, she's not mentally stable to be a mother. I said, now look at it from our side. I am a mother to 2 children. I will not use my hand, which is a part of my body, and I know when it is clean and it is not clean, to feed anyone else in this world. Just the way my children are a part of my body, because I gave birth to them, so is my hand. Okay? This is how I see it. This is how we see it. We use our hands. You see it as dirty, filthy, not our problem, really. And we will not force feed. Trust us. Second, you said, we might crush the children to death. So any sleep consultant in 2023, the discussion was happening in 2023, would tell you that co-sleeping is the best because of very logical reasons. When the child is out of the womb, is very scared, which is why you put it right next to the mother's heart. And that's how they sleep. Otherwise, they don't sleep. And yes, I've been to a sleep consultant because my son didn't sleep. Okay? There is no way we are going to crush them. Till 5 years of age, till date, I do not sleep. I cannot get sleep because they're both on 2 sides of my arms. So there is no crushing. We co-sleep. We've been doing what your sleep consultants are now talking about. We've been doing that for centuries. Third, you snatch my children and then you expect any mother to be sane. That is not going to happen. Yes, she stole her children from the childcare. So he's like, oh, if this has happened, it's really unfortunate. I said, cultural differences much? So, yeah, and this happens regularly. I think Ambassador Mohan Kumar was talking about population. Yes, we have a great population, 1.4 billion people, greatest demographic dividend, but Europe does not have it, which is why a lot of economic decisions, productivity, all of those come under concern. The book takes a very interdisciplinary sort of approach because, it tracks history. It goes down, as Ambassador Jitendranath Mishra was also talking about how the Maharaja of Bikaner was a signatory to the Treaty of Versailles. It starts from there. And as to how, when we got entry into the United Nations, even though technically we were not supposed to. So it has a bit of history. It definitely has a lot of economics because of Ambassador Mohan Kumar's expertise, WTO. And it tracks very pertinent issues which matter to us. we talk a lot about climate change, and I think every year we get choked during Diwali. So, but then, there's this perception which he mentions about as to how India has been a naysayer. But then he talks about the CBDR, or the common but differentiated responsibilities, which India was instrumental in creating. And, the other Western powers were clearly not interested in keeping up their political commitment. So he, he writes and he makes sure that all these narratives which exist about India being a naysayer get done away with. He moves very lucidly, very easily from one arena to the other. He talks about trade, he talks about climate change, and then he gets into geopolitics, the Russia-Ukraine war, and then he talks about multi-alignment as to how it protects India's vital national interests. So overall, the book traces the emergence of India as an important stakeholder, movement from just being a rule taker, the movement is still going on, to a rule shaper. And he does talk about in the conclusion as to what could it be which could hold back or ensure that this moment disappears. And he talks about if there is no internal balancing, if the economy does not become a $10 trillion economy, then of course this positive momentum which we have will possibly disappear. So, and he gives a lot of policy prescriptions as to what all need to be done. How do we move on, and how do we ensure that the moment is there, and we can one fine day say that yes, the moment has arrived. It's not yet arrived for us, but one must never give up hope. The book was submitted before the G20 summit, which is probably why, even though there's a mention of it, there's not too much of delving into it. So I think we will need another book from you, sir. What could also be added is the segment on critical minerals, because we are negotiating a lot, and a lot of flurry of discussions are happening between the EU, the US, India, and so on. The world is getting embroiled in more and newer forms of conflict. So AI is a very disruptive force. I think India is talking to a lot of like-minded partners on AI as well. So if the next book could also cover that, it would be great. So overall, my understanding is that this book is very important. I suggested this book to that friend of mine and said that you read this book as well, and you'll understand why we behave the way we behave in certain ways. And I'm not going to talk about the poverty veto and the litmus test and so on, because the other panelists have already mentioned it. So it's an excellent read. In case any one of you needs it, reach out to me. Yeah, I've done some colorful markings, but you can still read it. Thank you so much for your patience.
So I have nothing by way of reaction except to agree actually with all of the points, including the shortcomings, because that's true. I mean, I have to also tell you, this is only my second book, so I'm not one of those. I remember talking to Mr. Shashi Tharoor, and he was asking me, I was lucky. He and Samir Saran did this in front of young scholars. So I asked Shashi, listen, how long do you take to write a book? I'm very ashamed, to kind of divulge the figure. He said, it takes me 1 year. I said, it's taken me 2.5 years. So that's, I think, a matter of perspective as well. So I completely agree that my initial manuscript was 400 pages. And the publishers said, you've got to be out of your mind. Nobody will read your book. No, I mean, Ajay Bisaria, one of our colleagues, has written for 425 pages on Pakistan. Maybe Delhi is obsessed with Pakistan, so people may read it. But, I see. So they are very clear. HarperCollins, Aleph, the major publishers are very clear. The right size is 300. By the way, this is one of the first books, if not the first book, which does not have an index. It's interesting. And they have a bloody QR code where you use your... Yes, but...
It doesn't have notes. So every time I wanted to check where the
Sorry,
notes are, I would
sorry, end notes, correct.
It has an index.
Yes,
It's a good book that way.
yeah. I'm so happy you corrected me. If there is an index, there is no end notes. And the end notes is another 25 pages, and they said it will become too big. So 300 seems to be the limit for your... You are the reasons why my book got abridged from 400 to 300. They're saying you are used to 140 syllables in a Twitter. So they're saying 300 is enough. If they read 300, you'll get a Nobel Prize. So anyway, I'm joking. No, I have nothing much to say actually on domestic politics. You know, I was, the reason why I was a little bit cynical, I'll try not to be cynical, is because there are only two people who made sense to me in the domestic politics. One was Shashi Tharoor, who immediately, as is his wont, you know, he doesn't ponder too much. He's a conviction politician. So when Russia happened and Ukraine happened, he put out a tweet saying, we're on the wrong side of history. I loved it. But the very next day, the Congress party spoke, these are his personal views. We don't share it. That's what the Congress party said. So I've quoted that as well. And similarly, one of my singular most regrets was I leaned heavily on Ambassador Chandrasekhar Dasgupta. I must have had hours of conversation, and then he died. Before, he said, Mohan, I'm looking forward to your book. I said, sir, I don't know whether it'll meet your high standards. But he kind of helped me navigate climate change, especially CBDR. But then he died in between. So anyway, but you're so right. I mean, with the Jairam Ramesh and Shyam Saran, Chandrasekhar Dasgupta on the other side, no meeting ground. I mean, India spoke in very, very different voices. And so my problem with Manmohan Singh is such a decent guy, good prime minister. But you need to make sure at one time who's your key negotiator. You can't have these two guys speaking two different things and so on. Anyway, so nothing much more to add. Any questions from students? Because that's more important. Yeah, sure. Mohan, and then, do you mind if I, please, somebody has to do it. No. Go ahead, Mohan, then you. जल्दी बोलो.
Hello.
Mohan
Am
is
I
from
audible?
Nepal,
Yeah.
and my student as
So
well.
my question is also vis-a-vis Nepal. So my first question is, in your book you have identified two strong prima facie issues to be brought into the International Court of Justice. The first one is concerning financial transfers from developed to developing and least developed countries, which particularly resonates with me as my country is the current chair of UN LDC group as well. Second is the need of carbon space for India, recognizing the fact that four world's largest economies have followed high carbon pathway of development. So as an author and former diplomat, what are your recommendations for both Nepal as a chair of LDC group and India as an emerging economy to deal with these issues in future? My second question is about the negotiating strategy imparted by India and Global South, in which you talked of missed trick referring to the concept of polluter pays principles in your book. In your view, how should this strategy should be taken into account in future vis-a-vis UNFCCC negotiations? Thank you.
So very briefly, before I lose track, no, on the chairmanship of Nepal and on the carbon space, I've said what I've said, and I'm serious. Sunita Narayan told me they will very easily do a case for India, and we can take it to the international. Now, look, there are some things that you have to do in diplomacy without looking at the end game or the outcome. I'm not saying that this will necessarily make United States or Europe change tack. In fact, Europe is hell-bent on bringing carbon border adjustment mechanism. That's going to be the next big battle, frankly, because it's going to affect India, especially in sectors like steel, cement, fertilizer. So it's going to be a major problem. Also read Macron's speech. I'm writing about it in Hindustan Times, but one of the most cerebral leaders in Europe is Emmanuel Macron. And he has made two speeches. One is 2017, you don't have to worry, in Sorbonne. But he has made a speech 2 weeks ago in Sorbonne, which I am dissecting. Very interesting what he says about Europe versus US and so on. It's a speech that all of you should read. It's available in English as well. So Mohan, I have nothing more to tell you except to say that whatever is in my book, I mean it. I don't think I meant it rhetorically, that we should take a case to the International Court of Justice. They have created an environmental bench. And my worry is if India doesn't do it. See, for example, polluter pays principle. You are so right. And Chandrasekhar Dasgupta agreed with me. He says, Mohan, this is good that people like you are looking at it. Of course, it's very easy to look at these things from the comfort of your home. When you are negotiating there, these guys did such a good job. You would never have had CBDR without Chandrasekhar Dasgupta, frankly. I have made another interesting point in my book. As long as the initial negotiations were with MEA negotiators, we did well. And then we passed it on to the Ministry of Environment, and then everybody knows what happened. Nobody has picked up on that. But I really meant it. We have some outstanding people who did this. So I really mean what I say. I think we should do these things, not with a view to knowing what you would get, whether Nepal gets money or not, I don't know. But I think you should keep doing it. It'll create negotiating space for you. It'll create leverage, maybe in other areas. That's the way you should look at international negotiations, not treat each issue as, what can we get out of it. Just create these levers. Some of them will prove to be handy later.
Good afternoon, sir. So thank you for your amazing talk. We really enjoyed it. Your book also shares the same publishing year as Dr. S. Jaishankar's Why Bharat Matters. So I'd like to ask you how your books complement each other, yours and S. Jaishankar, because both of them are covering a moment that India is now emerging into.
No, I hesitate comparing myself with Jaishankar in any way, frankly. He's a friend because we used to call him first name. He's 4 years removed from me in seniority. And I must tell you, there's a very interesting rule in the IAS and Foreign Service. It's called the Golden 7-Year Rule. You call somebody sir or madam if there is a difference of 6 years and above. So Jaishankar didn't fit that, so we used to call him Jai. He used to sit next door as JSAMS and I was JSBSM. Now, of course, he's his ability to write a book is actually also based on his position and who he is targeting. For example, this is not, don't mistake this in any way. I've told him also, so it's not, nobody can write a book like him because there are no notes there. There are no footnotes there. That only Shashi Tharoor and Jaishankar can do. Mohan Kumar cannot do that. If I write a book without notes and without researching, nobody even among you will read it. Even if I force you to read it. You have to do the what my daughter calls the bitch work or the grunt work. You have to do that in writing a book. There is no other way out for me. He has this huge advantage that if he wants to convey, for example, that statement of his to Europe, that Europe has to stop thinking that Europe's problems are the world's problems and the world's problems are not Europe's. It's been accepted hook, line and sinker by every European politician. Every European politician is mouthing it. And what was Jaishankar's reaction to the protests in Colombia? Did you guys notice that? Huh? It was amazing. It was amazing. He said, what matters is not what countries say abroad. It is what countries do at home. I think he gave it to the Americans where it hurts. It doesn't matter. They came and said, why are you arresting Kejriwal? Why are you doing this? That's easy. So he said, what matters? And this is Jaishankar's absolutely, fantastic brilliance. You can interpret it in a million ways. If you ask him, are you aiming at Americans? He'll say, no. I was targeting myself. I was telling my people also we should be doing things at home. We should not be doing. He can say that. He can really turn around and say that and shut up the Americans. So that is, I think, Jaishankar's brilliance. So you shouldn't really compare me. Mine is more, what I'm trying to do is get people to be interested. If the man in the street can understand why, the question is, why were we made the scapegoat in Glasgow rather than China? They got India to stick its neck out and say we cannot accept to the complete phase out of coal. This is so stupid. If I was India's minister, I would have said, go to hell. Why are you asking me to say that? Ask China. They're consuming more coal than the rest of the world. But China, US do a deal, and we are the fall guy. This is so dumb. It is just a rookie error, frankly. But that is what happens if you give it to the mighty IAS. I won't say that anyway. I withdraw my remarks anyway. Absolutely.
Is it right to affirm, in terms of negotiation strategies, there's a contemporary update to non-alignment, which is known as proactive neutrality. Essentially entails that India has moved from a phase of passive disengagement to active non-engagement. So in the scheme of conflicts, especially Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, is it right to affirm that India is resorting to the idea of proactive neutrality, and from passive disengagement we have moved to the negotiating strategy of active non-engagement?
So you're using a lot of words. I'll have to think about it. But no, seriously, that's fine that you're thinking about it. And if my book has helped you do that, it's fantastic, I think. But what is clear to me is the following. Non-alignment is dead as a doornail. And we have moved to what is now being described as multi-alignment, where you engage with all. But this also means that you have become less idealistic and more pragmatic. Without a doubt, our foreign policy has definitely become, I mean, can you even imagine 25 years ago things happening in Gaza, and we are adopting a twin strategy where bilaterally we are actually saying Israel has a right to defend itself. That's what we are saying. And our Prime Minister said that, others have been saying it. But in the UN, we have instructed our permanent representative to New York to keep saying two-state solution, humanitarian tragedy. Then we have given 70 tons of material for whatever it is worth to Gaza. And we have clearly decided in the multilateral fora, we will push for the strategy we've always pushed. That is, support for Palestine and so on. Bilaterally, it's very clear we have something terribly important going with Israel. And we are not going to sacrifice that at the altar of whatever. So it's very clear to me. It's a paradigm shift in India's foreign policy, and this is only one example. I think there are a number of other examples, and all you have to do is see the kind of representation we send to non-aligned summits. Non-aligned summits. I'm not talking of non-aligned conference. Non-aligned summit. We've gone very conveniently from PM in the past to External Affairs Minister, to Minister of State, and we have now reached the level of Secretary. My joke was that there will come a time when we shall pick out the first guy from the corridors of MEA and say, hey, can you represent us? The South African diplomat is here, but you're not going to quote me and get me into trouble. I'm much retired anyway. And so if you say to anybody that I said this, I will deny it vehemently. So you can do what you want. But really, I think we have to be honest. Please, so I'm going to stop here and ask my colleague.
I have a question. I mean, reading your book increased, not that I knew very much about these subjects, but it certainly increased my respect for the Indian Foreign Service. But then, my question is that, you make a reference to that with the negotiating skills that India had, you got a 10-year window of the multi-fiber agreement ended, and we wasted the 10 years. We didn't do it. Now, the reason I think is this because, in my experience in working in the UNDP, when I go to Cambodia or Laos, small countries, their view is that they will take their commitments to the United Nations treaty bodies, their international agreements, seriously, because it's only in the General Assembly they count for same as the mighty United States. But every ministry I've been to, Labor Ministry, Women and Child, in Cambodia and in Laos, the people in that ministry were absolutely knowledgeable about what are the treaties that their country is a party to, what has been negotiated, and what are their obligations. I regret to say that except for the treaties division in India, and because MEA, which does all this, does not communicate to other ministries what is your obligation. If only we followed the ILO conventions on decent work, we wouldn't have this situation where, the big buyers of garments will say, we're not buying from India, because we are not sure whether India adheres to child labor conventions, the decent work conventions. But Cambodia goes overboard, persuading and convincing the international market that come and visit our factories, they are not like Rana Plaza and, sweatshops. So why hasn't the MEA, is it possible that the MEA communicates to other departments of ministries of the government of India? You make a reference to how we respect our commitment to the UN Charter and to the treaties. But actually, in fact, there's very little adherence to UN standards in the running of the government of India. You may blame the IAS for it, I'm not sure.
No.
But you haven't done your part, it seems to me, in educating other ministries as to what are their obligations and what they should do following what you've done in an international forum.
So you make a good point, and I don't think I'm going to, what shall I say, brush it under the carpet by, attributing it to one service or the other. But I want you to consider only one thing, which is the federal nature of our polity. Do you think it's, Cambodia, Laos is like treating a small state in India? We've got these big states and state center, states have to respect. You know the wide difference of obligations among UN conventions between Tamil Nadu and Uttar Pradesh? Please tell me.
Look, this is, for many things, saying that India is sui generis helps it get away, but you say it and justify why you use that phrase. I don't think it's a problem. Size doesn't matter here. It is the complete ignorance on the part of officials in the ministries, whether it is in the state government or the government of India, about what are our treaty obligations, what follows from that, and what steps they should take internally, domestically. Otherwise, you wouldn't have that ruining the 10-year gap. What did you negotiate that for?
Yeah, I agree. Hard to counter that, actually. Yeah. Any other question from students? We don't want to. Yeah, go ahead, Shreyas.
Professor, so
We have still 10 minutes
yeah,
more.
so there's a lot of
Shipriya, 10 minutes.
there's a lot of pessimism when it comes to us signing free trade agreements. Why are we taking so long with UK? Why are we not doing it tomorrow? But recently we had this very innovative free trade agreement with the European Free Trade Agreement partners, which was so radical. It's become like my favorite document to read because we're getting so much out of this. Do you think we have to kind of reimagine how we look at free trade agreements itself and no longer look at just goods and services and move beyond that?
No, Shreyas, I think you make a very good point. I too was struck by that model. You should explain the model because many students may not be aware. This is the first free trade agreement that India has signed with a group of countries called EFTA, European Free Trade. It's a very small number of countries. It's not EU. We are talking Liechtenstein and Switzerland and so on, where India has said, okay, we will give you tariff concessions. As you know, a typical free trade agreement comprises tariff concessions. Everybody wants tariff concessions from India because of guys like you, young consumers, and you are interested in buying foreign goods and so on. So they say, you reduce the tariffs, we will be able to sell more to India. Then India asks the question, what is in it for us? What can you possibly sell to Liechtenstein? Liechtenstein is the size of Rohini, for God's sake. What can you sell to Rohini? How many people are there in Rohini, first of all? This was the problem that we had. So what Shreya is saying is interesting. We said, okay, we will have apples and oranges kind of an FTA. We will lower tariffs. Your obligation is to invest $100 billion in India in 10 years. If you don't do it, it's a very weak clause, Shreyas, but I'm nitpicking. The idea is radical. You're completely right. So if at the end of 10 years, Liechtenstein and Switzerland and the rest of them don't invest $100 billion in India, we have the right to renege on tariff concessions. I think it's brilliant. Whoever thought about it is brilliant because you will never be able to, first of all, even Liechtenstein, the size of Rohini, whatever, you won't be able to export because you're not competitive. Somebody else will export. China will export. So I think this is a good thing we have done, and maybe we should do it with the EU as well. So you're quite right. Through 2-3 problems with FTA that India has. One is, we have exactly 1.5 persons in the Ministry of Commerce who negotiate FTA for a country of 1.4 billion. And that, I'm sorry if I say IAS, Professor Sudarshan will again kill me, but it's a fact. It has got all to do with that service because they don't want to share power. Otherwise, tell me, have you guys heard of Indian Trade Service? No. Tell me, who should be doing trade policy? A collector from Jhumri Talaya? It should be the Indian Trade Service. But no, the Indian Trade Service is used to the IAS officers normally tell the Indian Trade Service officers to photocopy and bring cups of chai. That's all the Indian Trade Service guys are doing. We have a trade service. We have an Indian Economic Service. Have you heard of this at least? So what do you think they are doing? They should be the chief economic advisor. But these things don't happen in India because, and I'm not saying the foreign service is necessarily maybe better, but then we are always peripheral. We are not in the central scheme of things in India. I think the general, shall I say, disinclination and even somewhat detesting experts. I've never seen this in any other country. I mean, if I meet an expert on trade policy, a natural inclination of a diplomat and IAS officer should be, okay, he knows more about this than me. Can I get something out of him? He's not going to replace you, for God's sake, as Joint Secretary, Ministry of Commerce. But it is your duty to kind of make the guy feel good and say, listen, I'm happy to learn from you. But here, no. This guy will say, hey, you shut up. I know more than you. That's the first thing which civil servants do, which is so sad because that has cost. Yeah, absolutely.
Always. And in my experience, if somebody cannot speak English fluently, our senior officers from the government of India will stop listening to them.
That too. And this is a major problem with Southeast Asia, because we consider Southeast Asia vastly inferior because they can't speak like me and Dean Sudarshan or anybody. And for me, this was brought home to me when in one intellectual property rights meeting, I was waxing eloquent like I'm doing now, and I was expecting support from ASEAN, and one of them spoke briefly. I said, this is all you can speak? Then that guy lost his temper because I was provoking him. He's actually from Indonesia. He told me, Mohan, we are doers, you are talkers. Please do what you best do. We will do what we do best. It hit me so bad I didn't sleep that night. because it's true. We are talking all the time. They are saying, listen, we may not speak like you, but we have achieved so much progress in our countries. So don't treat us like this. English should not be the yardstick for diplomats. Anyway, now that era is over. We are going to speak in Bhojpuri in the Foreign Service. So be prepared for it. So thank you guys. Anything else? Yeah? Okay, last question. No, I'll give you the last word. Jitu. No, after this. No. Yes.
Right, sir.
Introduce yourself as well.
Yes, my name is Sarthak. I'm a first-year student of Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. My question, sir, since you strike the entire idea of India being a naysayer, I would just like to bring in a few points as to how entirely in the WTO communications, we've been highlighting as to how there are procedural and structural issues that exist within the organization. I don't think the issue stands with us being a naysayer. I think everyone listens to the no, but nobody listens to the reasons why we say a no in the WTO. And also and I think this is a legacy that was perpetrated initially with the dissenting judgment of Radha Binod Pal in the International Tribunal of the Far East. And I think those very structural differences, do you think that India has the capability? Is it India's moment right now to at least make people listen to the reasons that we have for saying a no in structural issues? And do we really need an external affairs minister to go out and take a very hard-line stance, which previous external affairs ministers maybe did not take? And do we really need to have that media publicity for all to engage in public diplomacy with a manner like that?
No. The answer to that question, Jitu, I'm going to hand it over to you. The answer to that question is, I think we need a bit of that publicity as well. So let's not belittle that. But I agree with you, that alone is not going to get you far. I have made the point, frankly, that all these things, whether you make your naysaying known without reasons, with solid reasons. For example, take agriculture, take food security. The same countries which criticized the government of India for not allowing the farmers to come into Delhi, right? You have these farmers mainly from Punjab who are agitating. They are agitating for something which is diametrically opposite to India's WTO commitments. You should know that. We have committed to the WTO that we will not exceed a particular limit when it comes to subsidies, right? And these farmers are saying, no, we will only grow rice. Punjabis never ate rice, to the best of my knowledge, 20 years ago, but now they eat everything, I understand. But, Punjab has no business growing rice, actually. If you actually look at what they've been eating, the Punjab has become a desert. There is no groundwater resources because rice requires 20 times more water. But anyway, all that is irrelevant or relevant but not direct to this issue. What is Government of India saying? They are saying, please switch to cash growing crops. You are just producing more and more rice, which was absolutely relevant when India was facing famine 20 years ago, but now completely irrelevant because the rice being grown, we are feeding the rats in the FCI godowns. My driver says he will not eat that rice. He says, "Main usko chunga nahi." So nobody is eating. So we are telling them, we'll give you time, no problem, but shift to cash growing crops. They are saying, no, we will continue to produce rice and you will pay the minimum, what is it called? Minimum support price. Minimum support price is so much more than the price fixed by the Government of India, that by the WTO reference price. That's a problem. Second problem, New Zealand and Australia and Thailand are saying, why are you growing rice to feed the rats? Don't grow rice. We will supply rice when there is a shortage. We are rice growing countries. So I think, frankly, we have a problem, and it's not about structural reasons that you mentioned. My simple point is this: all of these things will not disappear, but the problems will become less acute if you become a $10 trillion economy, because then you can go to these countries and say, if you're going to mess with me in agriculture, then I am going to mess with you by not buying your Boeing planes, not buying your Airbus. And immediately they will say, okay, boss, please do whatever you want in agriculture, ye kharid lo. That's the only way it works. I think everything else is a way. That's the main message of my book. For God's sake, become a 10 trillion economy as quickly as possible. Make all of you consume whatever you want. It's fine. In any case, you're going to do that. And in any case, we have created this massive population. It's a completely different debate I have with my friend Dean Sudarshan, whether it is an asset or a liability. Time will tell, but we have it. We might as well make something out of it, right? The answer is really, I think the bottom line is, we have to become a 10 trillion economy as quickly as possible, with the caveat, and Raghuram Rajan, I don't agree with him on many things, but on this he is right. There is no point in becoming 10 trillion if 9 trillion of that is owned by 1% of your population. Especially with names ending in A and I. I don't want to say that. Withdraw that remark also in front of my South African colleagues. So you have to have an equitable country, right? The wealth has to be distributed. So if you have that, I think the world will be at your feet. Jitu, last word, because I think we are all...
No. He said A and I. You didn't mean artificial. Wait. You didn't mean artificial intelligence. Just 4 very brief comments on what has been discussed. The first thing, IFS, peripheral definitely within the country. The political stalwarts, when they go abroad, Ambassador Saab, boliye kya karna hai? Sham ko kahan kare? Kya kare? They are like completely at our beck and call. When we come back to India, zarur aana, milna, khana khayenge, ye karenge, wo karenge. You make a call, ye kaun hai? End of story. So that's the reality, actually. So the IFS is different. It may be peripheral, but it's different because we have to work and survive in a highly competitive, meritocratic, international environment. The IS doesn't have to do that. I think that's what makes us different, because we have to survive in that, internationally. Even our staff is, on average, very good. Cultural differences, FTA, you spoke about with the British. It's actually about what you said. You help our agriculture, we buy your Boeings, right? So you accept migration and mobility from India, and we'll do the FTA, and we'll allow access to your whiskey and apples and whatever it is.
We produce the best whiskey.
Exactly, and in any case, we produce the best whiskey. Yeah, but they are obsessed with whiskey. They think, So it's actually a quid pro quo, migration and mobility, and the British are not giving an inch, and they are blaming us for that. The third thing is China-US deal, we are the fall guy. I've been saying this publicly, that once they make up, there will be something like a G2 again. This was Clinton's fantasy when he was the president. He tried to impose that on India to manage South Asia. You know, condominium of the US and China to manage Kashmir. Good heavens. And he was being feted by MPs and everyone was throwing petals on him when he came to India. He suckered us, really, honestly. The last point is, eating with a hand. This is true. It sounds like a joke. There's a novel, sir, called Desa Kara Patra by J.P. Das, Jagannath Prasad Das, who won the Saraswati Samman. This is a kind of a historical novel of 19th century Odisha, the Great Famine and all those things. Fantastic book. A Time Elsewhere, published by Penguins. He narrates an encounter. There's this Indian in Odisha, Katak Club. He goes to the club, first time Indians are allowed. The British see him, and then he starts eating with his hands. Haath se khana. So, what you doing? You guys are uncivilized. How can you eat with your hands? We have spoons. You have spoons? Okay, good, good. You use these. You know, I use my hands. You know why? Because they are my own. I know exactly what I'm doing. Because they are mine. So he's talking about hygiene. Because I know exactly what I'm doing.
There's an autobiographical story about eating with forks and spoons. I don't know if it's correct. It was attributed to Nehru saying to Lee Kuan Yew, it was at a home dinner. And Lee Kuan Yew, of course, is very Cambridge, more Cambridge than Nehru. Wanted a knife and fork, and Nehru was eating with his fingers. And Nehru is supposed to have told him that eating with implements is like making love through an interpreter.
Good. Absolutely.
On that extremely sexy note, shall we call it a day? Sri Parna, I'm looking to you.
That's why you have such large classes. You are
Thank
the
you.
sexy professor. Maybe.
Thank you so much for the wonderful questions and wonderful comments. I just want to add one bit about, do we really need that much media publicity? Okay, a couple of things. Let's look at reality. This, Gen Z is the dominant population in India because we have the largest population, positive population, dividend, and so on. As Ambassador Mohan Kumar was saying, his publisher also said that if you write too much, no one reads. What does Gen Z do? Looks at Instagram, Reels, media, etc. So Ambassador, E.M. Jaishankar, he's also contesting elections from, I think he's on a ticket somewhere. He's a politician, like so he has to take care of that. Let's look at, things very rationally. So he has to reach out to the people. He has to make sure that the people know, and the youngest people in India know as to what the government is doing. What can he utilize? He will use media, he will use reels, he will use all sorts of things, which is exactly what he is doing, which is exactly what every other politician in every other democratic country, even non-democratic country like China, is doing. So it's a very rational thing. We do need that media. Also, if our media doesn't have enough work or doesn't cover enough, then certain people do not give enough interviews. That narrative comes out, and then comes in backsliding of democracy from the West. So I think we're doing the right thing by giving that much media coverage to our policies. Thank you so much for your comments. Thank you so much for attending. And it was a wonderful discussion, and it's a wonderful book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.